The Germans called it the night monster, and the British, their most stubborn giant. It was born in agony, crashed on takeoff, burned in the factories, and yet it always rose into the sky to carry fire where it was awaited with terror. It was created from mistakes, restrictions, and fear. And this is precisely what made it an unbreakable machine. Why did Britain's first heavy bomber become a curse to its pilots, yet a legend to the enemy? Why did engineers call it a monster, and gunners pray never to see it from the inside again? And what secret lies behind the decision that caused it to lose the sky before its first flight? This is the story of an aircraft that was too big for its time. Night heavy as lead and filled with an unmistakable drone. It approaches from afar, slowly, building up, as if the sky itself is rising from the ground. Then, the sharp wail of sirens, the flash of searchlights, and among their beams, enormous shadows emerge. 4 engines pound the air in a rhythm of doom. From below, it looks like a nightmare embodied in metal. People freeze in fear, listening as the roar passes over their homes. It is the approaching Royal Air Force, RAF, and for Germany, these machines would become the true night monsters. When British bombers are mentioned, the Halifax or the Lancaster are usually recalled. But long before them, another giant appeared in the sky. Unwieldy, heavy, but the first to take on that terrible job. Its name was the short Stirling, the aircraft that began the history of British heavy bombers in the Second World War. It was born not as a legend, but as an experiment that became a combat machine against all odds. But to understand why its creation was such a crucial step, one must return to where it all began, to the years when no one knew that the sky could be a battlefield, when aviation was about romance, not a symbol of destruction. After the First World War, the British Empire was left with a powerful navy, but without powerful long-range aircraft. The air belonged to reconnaissance planes and light bombers, but not to giants. Yet one machine tried to change that, the 4-engine biplane Handley Page Falkland 1500. They called it the Super Handley. It was supposed to fly to Berlin, drop its payload onto the heart of Germany, and return. But the war ended before it could take off into combat. After the Treaty of Versailles, it was simply decommissioned. And the very idea of a heavy bomber dissipated in the fog of the post-war years. For many years, no one built anything similar. Only in the early 30s did Great Britain begin to realize again that the world was rapidly approaching a new storm. Tension was palpable in the air. Europe was heading towards what no one wanted but everyone expected. And when, in 1936, London decided to arm the sky with long-range bombers, it sounded like an admission. The world can no longer be saved by words. The Air Ministry issued a requirement. Specification B-1236. Dry lines that concealed a desperate attempt to regain superiority. The aircraft had to be fast, no less than 370 km/h, 230 mph, carry more than 3 tons of bombs, and fly for almost 5,000 kilometers, 3,100 miles. These were demands not for a machine, but for a dream. A 6-man crew, the ability to transport 24 soldiers. It all seemed too bold for the mid-30s. 15 companies submitted bids for the competition, but only 2 reached the actual work, Short and Supermarine. Fate decided that the Spitfire and the Stirling would be born almost simultaneously, but take different paths. In the design office in Rochester, engineer Claude Lipscomb and his team began the project under the designation S-29. The machine was intended to be not just heavy, but the largest that British industry could lift. But things went wrong early on. The ministry demanded the wings be shortened so the aircraft would fit into standard hangars. Logistics defeated aerodynamics. Instead of ideal proportions, the designers received a clumsy but manageable hulk. The Hercules engine was chosen, a powerful but capricious air-cooled unit. With it, the Stirling gained power but lost speed and altitude. Yet the project continued. No one suspected that the limitations written into the documents would forever strip the aircraft of its potential. To ensure the giant could take off at all, a scaled-down model was built. A half-size wooden aircraft designated S-31, the little brother of the future monster. It was made not for beauty, but for experimentation. Engineers checked everything, even the bomb bay doors, to understand how their opening affected handling. The first test pilot, Lawrence Parker, joked that he was the only item in the aircraft not to scale. But the jokes stopped when the S-31 took to the sky. In September 1938, it made its first flight. The machine was surprisingly docile. After the 12th flight, it was sent for state trials, where the experts drew the main conclusion. To improve takeoff and landing, the wing's angle of incidence needed to be changed. This requirement caused a storm in the design office. Changing the wing angle meant reworking the entire aircraft. Instead, the engineers decided to go another route, lengthen the landing gear struts, forcing them to fold twice. This decision would become the Stirling's trademark and, at the same time, its headache. By that time, war was inevitable. Europe was ablaze, and in Rochester, to the sound of anxious radio news, engineers were hastily building the first two full-size S-29s. When, in May 1939, one of them took to the air, it seemed Britain had finally gotten what it had lacked since the days of the Super Handley. But 20 minutes later, everything collapsed. The brakes locked on landing, the struts buckled, and the aircraft crashed right onto the concrete. The first Stirling did not live for even half an hour. Its wreckage became a lesson that could not be forgotten. 7 months later, the second prototype took off with strengthened struts and the same Hercules engines. It performed better, and in May of the following year, the first production bomber took to the air. The war was already on, and there was no more time. The factories were working at their limit, but production was slow. In August, German aviation struck Rochester. 6 finished aircraft were destroyed right on the airfield. In Belfast, 5 more. And yet, the Stirling survived. In October 1940, the first aircraft entered RAF squadrons. Thus, the giant returned to the skies over Europe, not ideal, imperfect, but ready to fight. After the end of the Great War, Britain seemed to have run out of steam. The empire stood at its peak. Its navy remained a symbol of strength. But the air, once full of daring experiments and dreams of flight, suddenly became empty. Biplanes, still designed for trench warfare, rusted on airfields, and the sky no longer saw those who could reach the horizon. Everything that flew was light, short range, as if the country itself was afraid to look again towards distant targets. British engineers had once tried to attempt the impossible, to build an aircraft capable of reaching Berlin. Thus, the enormous 4-engine biplane, the Handley Page 1500, nicknamed the Super Handley, came into being. It was a monster by the standards of its time, sad but majestic, like a steel ship lifted into the sky. Its task was not reconnaissance, but retaliation, to cross the sea, strike the heart of Germany, and return. But the war ended before it could prove its might. The guns fell silent, and the giant, for which the flight of the century was prepared, was left without a purpose. The Treaty of Versailles tied Britain's hands. Heavy bombers were deemed unnecessary, even dangerous for a new, peaceful world. The country lived under the illusion that a second catastrophe was impossible. While other powers accumulated armor and steel, British aviation was stuck in the past. Pilots trained on old machines, engineers went into private firms, and the very idea of a long-range strike was considered a relic of a brutal era. Only a few remembered the V-1500 as a reminder that one day the sky could once again become a weapon. And that moment arrived. By the mid-30s, the air over Europe was once again buzzing with alarm. Newspapers wrote about Luftwaffe maneuvers, new German engines, and strange speeches in Berlin. Britain, as if waking up, realized it had nothing to answer the growing threat. The nation of sailors had to remember how to fight in the sky. Thus began a race in which the price of error was measured not by a contract, but by the future. In the summer of 1936, London officially announced a competition under the code B-1236. It required designing a bomber that could carry almost 4 tons of bombs and fly further than any British aircraft had ever flown. Its speed had to exceed 370 km/h, 230 mph, a figure that seemed fantastical for such a massive machine. 15 companies responded to the invitation. Some proposed reworked seaplane projects, others risky schemes with multiple wings. But only 2 firms managed to stay in the game until the end: Supermarine and Short. Supermarine was already living through the birth of its future masterpiece, the Spitfire. They had to choose where to commit their efforts, to the high-speed fighter or to the heavy giant. They chose the former, and this choice would make them immortal. But the short firm decided to take a risk. Its designers did not have famous names, but they had the audacity to dream. Thus, in Rochester, on the bank of the Medway, amidst the fog and the clanging of rivets, the S-29 project was born. It was intended to become the pride of Britain, the first truly heavy bomber of the new war. But already on the blueprints, something that would destroy more than one British machine loomed over it: bureaucracy. The Air Ministry demanded that the aircraft fit into standard hangars, meaning the wings had to be shortened to 100 feet. To the engineers, this sounded like a death sentence. Shortening the wings meant losing lift, and thus altitude, range, and stability. Everything that made the aircraft a heavy bomber was being destroyed by a single line in a technical document. But there was no choice. They had to build an aircraft not according to the laws of aerodynamics, but according to the size of the hangar doors. Short complied. This is how the future Stirling lost the sky without ever touching it. But the designers did not give up. They were building not just a machine, they were building proof that Britain was still capable of surprising. The S-29 combined the naivety and courage of the era: a massive fuselage, a wing derived from a flying boat, new Hercules engines, and a rectangular silhouette, as if designed not for speed, but for tenacity. No one knew then that these decisions would make it the most controversial aircraft of its time, strong but doomed. And yet, it was in Rochester that they first felt that Britain was searching for its wings again. Only this time, those wings would carry not heroes, but bombs. And when they took to the sky, the world would understand that the old empire was ready to fight again, not on the sea, but in the clouds. On the sheets of draftsman's paper, where dreams of light fighters were usually born, something else was now growing, massive, straight, as if cast from steel. The short company designers were creating an aircraft that was not meant to be beautiful, it was meant to be strong. Thus, under the pencils of the engineers and the rhythmic tapping of adding machines, the silhouette of the future giant, the S-29, slowly took shape. It was built not for speed and maneuvers, but for endurance. Its body looked almost crude, a long, rectangular section fuselage designed to accommodate men, fuel, and bombs. The wings, borrowed from the Sunderland flying boat, seemed too thick, but they were the ones that could bear the weight of the 4 Bristol Hercules engines. These powerful motors promised the machine reliability and thrust, but at the same time, turned it into a resounding, flying block of metal and noise. When the engineers presented the project to the ministry, the reaction was cold. The papers were returned with a demand that nearly ruined the entire idea. The wings must be shortened to 100 feet. The hangars of the Royal Air Force could not accommodate a larger span. The designers understood what this meant. Loss of wing length meant a loss of lift, and thus altitude, range, and stability. Everything that made the aircraft a heavy bomber was collapsing because of a single line in a technical document, but there was no choice. They had to build the aircraft not according to the laws of aerodynamics, but according to the size of the hangar doors. They recalculated the loads, the angle of attack, the wing profile. Lipscomb and his team knew that if this project failed, Great Britain would again be without a heavy bomber. Every millimeter became a matter of faith that engineering could overcome common sense. Gradually, the metal monster took shape. Its construction was almost nautical. The fuselage was assembled from bolted sections with massive flanges. The skin of the hull was smooth, with strips laid on top to maintain pressure. Inside, the bomb bays were to be located beneath the deck, exactly where the main wing spars passed. These spars divided the bay into 3 narrow channels. Each channel held fittings for 227 kilogauss, 500 lb bombs, a total of 14 suspension points. But the engineers dreamed bigger. If the load were increased, it could carry almost 6 tons of ordnance. For Britain, this was a record. From the outside, the aircraft looked foreign, as if assembled from parts of different eras. The nose was sharp but heavy. The tail, with a single fin, looked like it belonged to an old transport. The empennage seemed too small for such a mass, but Lipscomb believed that the power of the engines would compensate for everything. He was creating a machine not for parades, but for war. Every detail was tested, every decision was debated. How to position the crew to survive a long flight over Europe. How many gun positions were needed to withstand a fighter attack? What shape should the canopy be so the navigator could see the target and the pilot the horizon? These questions were solved not by theory, but by nights over the drawing board and cups of strong tea in the cold workshops of Rochester. But beneath all this lay anxiety. No one knew if this monster would even fly. The calculations were contradictory. The aerodynamics were debatable. To ensure the aircraft wouldn't spin out on its first ascent, the engineers decided to build a scaled-down version, an exact copy, but half the size. It was meant to prove what the idea was capable of before metal and men were committed to it. Thus was born the mysterious S-31, the wooden double of the future giant. Light and almost a toy, but the fate of the entire program lay hidden in its plywood body. If it crashed, the project would be shut down. If it flew, Britain would have a chance. At that moment, no one realized that this small aircraft would be the first victory in the struggle for the sky, where giants were just beginning to wake up. When the Short Company engineers finished assembling the wooden S-31, no one in Rochester thought that this tiny creation would make history. Against the background of the giant S-29 blueprints, it looked almost ridiculous, like a toy made by a child who dreamed of building his own plane. But it was in this plywood miniature that the fate of the entire program was being decided. The S-31 was a half-scale copy of the future Stirling. It was assembled from wood, using parts from other aircraft. The wing was borrowed from the Scion Senior, the engines from old projects, but instead of 2 engines, it had 4 tiny Pobjoy Niagara engines, each with 90 horsepower. The machine was so carefully made that it even had working bomb bay doors installed to check how the opening and closing of the doors would affect flight. The crew consisted of 2 people, a pilot, and a flight test engineer. The pilot sat under a large transparent canopy, while the engineer was inside the fuselage, almost lying between the ribs, surrounded by instruments, tubes, and cables. The first pilot, Lawrence Parker, joked that he was the only item on board that was not to scale. And when he first climbed into the cramped cockpit, his knees hit the dashboard, so he had to tuck his legs up for takeoff. Despite its toy-like appearance, the S-31 proved to be surprisingly stable. In September 1938, it made its first flight, smoothly lifting off the runway to the enthusiastic gaze of the engineers. The small aircraft behaved docilely, obeying the controls with a precision that suggested it felt every movement of the pilot. After the 12th flight, it was sent to the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment, ANAEE, at Martlesham Heath, the place where the destinies of British aviation were decided. There, the S-31 went through dozens of checks. It was flown in storms, forced into spins, and subjected to G-forces and dives. And it was during these flights that engineers noticed that the aircraft tended to pitch down on landing due to the too short landing gear struts. This discovery was fateful. On the large Stirling, such an error could have led to a disaster. A non-standard solution was found. Lengthen the struts, but make them fold twice so they would fit into the engine nacelles. The S-31 continued to fly, becoming a true flying laboratory. New types of rudders, turret shapes, and engine fairings were tested on it. Sometimes, experimental coatings were applied to its skin to understand how metal and paint would behave at high speeds. Every flight brought the birth of the real giant closer, but there were also quirks. During one test, the pilot, pulling the control column too sharply, performed such a steep maneuver that the engineer sitting in the fuselage unexpectedly hit his head on the ceiling and swore so loudly that the sound was heard over the radio. The report was dry. Vibration of the crew observed during transition to a dive. Despite minor incidents, the S-31 proved the main point: the design works. It flew until 1943, longer than anyone expected, helping British engineers understand the behavior of the giants that were yet to be launched into the sky. It was this plywood aircraft that provided the answers without which the short Stirling might have remained on the drawing board. When, in November 1939, the tests of the little S-31 were nearing their end, 2 full-size prototypes were already standing on the airfield, ready for their first taxi runs. The workshop smelled of kerosene and varnish. The propeller blades gleamed in the light of the lamps. Everyone believed that now everything would work out, that the giant born from the plywood miniature would finally rise into the sky and prove Britain has regained its right to rule the air. But fate, as always, had its own script. Spring 1939. At the airfield in Rochester, where the roar of engines mingled with the sound of the river, engineers and pilots gathered near the silver fuselage of the new aircraft. The first real short Stirling stood ready for flight. It was heavy, powerful, with 4 shiny propellers that seemed to crave the air themselves. Everyone knew that this takeoff would be decisive. If the machine failed, everything that had been done in recent years would be for naught. The pilot gave the throttle. The aircraft lunged forward, shaking on the broken runway. The air vibrated, and suddenly, the heavy hulk smoothly lifted off the ground. For a moment, it seemed that everything was behind them, that Britain had finally received its steel giant. But the joy was short-lived. On landing, the brakes locked, the landing gear folded, and the machine crashed onto the concrete, breaking the propeller blades, the fuselage, and the hopes. The first Stirling did not live for even half an hour, but the British never had the habit of stopping after the first failure. 7 months later, the second prototype took to the sky with strengthened struts, the same Hercules engines, and the same determination. It flew heavily, as if every meter of air was given with effort, but it flew. The engineers finally saw, the idea works. In May of the following year, the first production Stirling took to the air. Its shiny fuselage reflected the morning sun, and it seemed that history itself had breathed a sigh of relief. But the joy was short-lived. The pace of production could not keep up with the war. The factories in Rochester were just beginning to assemble a new batch when German aircraft appeared overhead. On August 9th, Luftwaffe bombs tore up the runway, destroying 6 finished machines. A few days later, the strike hit Belfast. 5 more aircraft were reduced to ashes without leaving the ground. Of the 20 Stirlings assembled, less than half remained operational. But even from under the wreckage, the Stirling rose again. Its assembly was relocated, and parts were made up overnight. Workers riveted fuselages under the wail of sirens. By October 1940, the first aircraft finally entered operational units. Britain once again had a heavy bomber, not ideal, imperfect, but ready for battle. The 7th Squadron arrived at Oakington Base. Pilots looked at the new aircraft with respect and caution. It was huge, required 2 pilots, and special skill. The conversion took 2 months, and it was only in the winter that the machines went into battle for the first time. The night of February 10-11, 1941. The first mission, Rotterdam. The crews climb into the darkness, where there is no horizon or stars, only a black ocean and the pale flashes of anti-aircraft shells. The Stirling flies slowly but steadily. The high-explosive bombs fall accurately on the oil storage facilities. Everyone returns. This is the first success, the first combat flight that proves the machine is ready to fight. Then came new targets, the German battle cruisers, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. First failures, then a breakthrough. On July 23rd, a Stirling scored a direct hit on the Scharnhorst in the port of La Pallice. The crew cheered, but on the way back, they were attacked by fighters. The aircraft was shot down and no one returned. The price of victory was too high. Combat experience showed that the Stirling was stable, held reliably in the air, and could withstand hits that would have sent other machines into the sea. One returned to base without a meter of its right wing, another with 3 engines pierced. A pilot, severely wounded, held the control column for 5 hours, dragging the machine over the water. But with this, its weaknesses also emerged. The Stirling was too heavy to climb to high altitude. Its practical ceiling barely exceeded $6,000 MERS, $20,000 FT, less than the Lancaster and Halifax. With every new modification, armor enhancement, addition of gun turrets, radios, and auxiliary tanks, the aircraft lost altitude, turning into an iron beast that could survive, but not outrun the enemy. And yet, among the crews, it was treated with respect. They said the Stirling knew how to endure. A factory test pilot once, demonstrating its maneuverability, performed a bell figure in the bomber, a vertical climb with a stop and a smooth fall. When the aircraft leveled out again, the rear gunner, convinced they were falling, was already reaching for his parachute. The Stirling was not only a bomber. It was used for mine-laying, cargo transport, and delivering weapons to partisans in France. Later, mandrel radio countermeasures were installed on its sides, jamming the German Freya radars. These aircraft did not always see the front lines, but they helped others fly in the darkness, blinding the enemy. By the autumn of 1943, the Stirling was obsolete. It was replaced by the faster, higher-flying Halifax and Lancaster, but it did not disappear. It simply changed roles. Now these giants became transport machines. On June 6, 1944, the day the Allies landed in Normandy, the Stirling took to the sky again. 4 squadrons towed Horsa gliders loaded with paratroopers. They flew at low altitude under fire, dragging winged barges carrying men. Then Arnhem, Nijmegen, the Rhine crossings. There, the Stirling proved again. It was built to endure. Its cargo bays no longer held bombs, only crates of weapons, ammunition, and fuel. Sometimes it carried 120 standard fuel barrels. And all of this across the front, in any weather. During the war, 2,183 aircraft of all modifications were built. They carried out 18,444 combat sorties, dropped almost 28,000 tons of bombs, and laid 20,000 naval mines. The losses were terrible: 769 machines, 641 of them in combat. The Stirling did not become a symbol of victory. It was overshadowed by the Halifax and the Lancaster, but it was the first to go the distance from a plywood mock-up to the front line. The first to prove that Britain could build heavy bombers no worse than Germany. Its wings opened the way for those who came after, and when the last Stirlings landed on the airfields, they were met not with applause, but with silence. For sometimes the first one pays the highest price of all.